The issue that I was thinking about was one that was raised yesterday, which is two issues of space. What makes space Jewish? And how did Jews perceive the space or understand the space in which they lived? And I decided to try and approach it by looking at a very limited aspect of Jewish space, which is the house. The space can be divided into in all kinds of ways. And we've talked a lot about Jewish quarters and Jewish neighborhoods as part of urban space, but in fact the urban house is itself a very important aspect of urban space, and one which every Jew who lived in a city had to come to terms with. Now, the community I'm going to look at mostly is a community in northwestern Poland called Poznan. Do you want to press the first slide? Now, I prepared a dinky little PowerPoint to help try and keep us all awake. Poznan, one of the major regional capitals of Poland. This is the regional capital of Great Poland, a very large and important city in the 17th century. The Jews were able to live only in a very small portion of Poznan. If you can see, it's marked off, that's right, there, yeah, that's right. That's the Jewish quarter. Okay. They only have two main streets, Bet and Gimel, and two crossing streets that go across. They don't exist now. They were made of wood, they burned down. So this is a map that reconstructs the Jewish quarter. Within that small district, which made up about 11% of Poznan's area, lived just under 3,000 Jews. When you make up populations of cities, you always have to remember that an urban population is made up not just of the people who actually live in the city, but of the settlements, villages and towns around the city which belong to the city. They fall under the urban jurisdiction. So when you try to work out the role of the Jews in the urban population, general population is not the best figure. The next figure, population living within the walls, is the most important one. And you can see the Jews make up slightly less than 3,000 out of a total of about 7,000, which means that they are about 40% of the population living in some 11% of the urban environment, which means it gets pretty crowded. Another line I put on the table, an average number of residents in each house. In the Polish houses, or the houses in the Polish region, there were 9 people on average. In the houses in the Jewish area, 21 people lived in each house on average. So you're talking about pretty crowded, pretty cramped, a lot of people in a very small space. The first text I have deals with issues of overcrowding. It's a regulation put out by the Poznan community. Okay, so it's the regulations of the elected officials, written and signed at the bottom of the page, dealing with matters and arrangements about apartments, renting out heated rooms, and taking in a lodger. Okay, there are 3 small regulations here. This was made in 1686, that's the Hebrew date at the bottom. When someone sells a house, the next door neighbor has no right of Bar Metzira. Bar Metzira is a halachic category whereby a neighbor of any property has the right to buy out a purchaser, so as to keep his rights over his immediate environment. Which means that if you have a house and you sell it, your next door neighbor theoretically has the right to buy out the purchaser. Okay? And the community is opposed to this. Why? It says only the joint owner of the house has such a right. Apart from that, the right of Bar Mitzvah is annulled. This is the right and proper thing to do, and its cancellation, no such judge should grant it. Why? Because the community is interested in ensuring that as many people as possible own property. They don't want property to be concentrated in a limited number of hands. Because what will happen is what we'll see in the next regulation. From today, it is forbidden to join 2 houses by breaking down the common wall, to make a new entrance from the heated room to a bedroom, or to add an apartment in this way. Okay, what's the problem? If you own 2 apartments, you join them together, you make for yourself a very nice, large apartment where you can live with your family, but there are lots of other Jews in Poznan who want to live there, and they've got nowhere to live. So the community here is trying to sort out house ownership. and make sure that property is distributed, if not equitably, at least to reduce the degree of inequitability. And that isn't English at all. Okay, and at the end it said the total ban is imposed in order not to decrease the amount of housing, all the more so it is totally forbidden to leave a heated room empty without tenants. And the question of heated rooms also came up yesterday. A heated room, also known in Hebrew as bet choreth, a winter room, is the heart of any apartment. Okay, most apartments in Poznan had one heated room, which was where everything happened. You had the stove there, you could cook there. If it was winter, you went in there. And it had other rooms where you went to sleep, or you had other rooms for activities or a workshop or whatever. Okay, so they talk about a heated room, which is Stube in German and in Yiddish, Izba in Polish. They mean essentially an apartment. Okay, and the community goes on. The rental for a heated room with 2 additional rooms is 80 zlotys. The rental for a heated room with 3 rooms is 100 zlotys, and the rental room for a heated room with 4 rooms is 120 zlotys. So they're capping the rents. Okay? Once again, it's all part of a most important attempt to ensure that as many people in Poznan have somewhere to live. Now, there are all kinds of interesting issues that come out of this one. I know I'm being very, very telegraphic, but it really is late and I'm very tired. First of all, what would I take out of this to understand? The idea of Bar Mitzvah ties up with what we talked about in the Eruv earlier. The Jews of Poznan saw their houses not just as houses, but as having a religious aspect to them. A Jewish house was part of the legal system of Poznan. It was part of the communal system of how the Jews ran themselves. It was part of a halachic system. So that a Jewish house was different from a Christian house. It's the house owned by Jews because there were all kinds of other laws that affected it. So this meant that when you perceived your house, it wasn't just a house where Jews lived. There's something quintessentially Jewish about it. It can change. It's not something that doesn't move. It's not fixed, but it changes. That's one thing which I find very interesting, and I think it's worth pursuing, although I'm not quite sure how you do it. The other 2 regulations say to me something else. In all the work on the moralistic literature of early modern Polish Jews and Jews in general, the idea that poverty is God-given and that one's social status is something that reflects on one's relationship with the Almighty is here mitigated. Because the community is saying, you can be rich and that's great, but that doesn't give you unlimited power. There are social rules and regulations that mitigate your socioeconomic status. So here too, the question of housing is it's coming to some kind of conflict with religious ideas and religious perceptions of the world. Equally, the Bar Mitzvah is cancelled here. There's no reason given why they should cancel this Talmudic regulation. It's just cancelled because it's not suitable to the conditions. So that's kind of the first step. That's the first stage of what houses meant, how you perceived the house. Okay, so we've talked a bit about houses. We have a nice house list from 1619, also quite parallel to the one we heard about yesterday. Not quite as detailed. And I've extracted from that, very, very briefly, to look at the size of houses that there were in Poznan in 1619. The good thing about this census is it was made at the request of the Jews. They wanted more living space in town. They were negotiating with the council to have another place to live. So they had every reason not to hide their numbers as they normally did in censuses, but to put everything on the table. So this is slightly...
inflated?
I don't think they'd be allowed to. I mean, I don't think the authorities would allow them to inflate seriously, but at least they couldn't hide. But if you see, look, the vast majority of the houses have between 11 and 25 tenants in them. These are big places. Family size is roughly 4 people per family. It's very interesting. I don't fully understand it, but it's quite clear. These are not big families. So if you talk about 11 people, you're talking about 2 or 3 families. And if you're talking about 25 people, it's 6 families living in one house. Okay? Houses are not very tall. 3 stories is the maximum. Most houses have only 2 stories. So it's small houses and lots of people.
Yes, but
This is what the question asked before. Are these, when you say houses, are these houses like blocks built around courtyards?
No.
Okay, these are...
There's these urban street houses.
Okay.
Right. They have a number of apartments in them. I'll have it on the table a bit later on. They can have 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 heated rooms in them. So they extend back. They're very narrow and long and very cramped to live in.
But it wasn't necessarily communal living.
Well, we'll see in a minute. It affects the way people live. But no, it could be 5 apartments in one house. And if you look at the bigger houses, that's certainly how it was. That you have it's like apartment blocks, but small and very cramped. Yes.
Well, I was going to not ask about house people, what's a family? Is that part of the talk too?
No.
So what's a family? Are you looking at the data let you know whether the houses with 2, 3, or 4 families in them are related to each other or not?
I can't tell that, unfortunately. Because all it gives you, all the source gives you is the name of the owner, or the primary person, and the number of people.
Would you expect extended families in
yes, I would expect that if you have 2 families, in a significant proportion of the cases, you'd be talking about fathers and sons, or mothers and daughters, or... Sorry?
Extended families that are really living together, not where they have separate units in the same...
No, I'm talking within each heated room, the figures say, on average, about 2 families. That is 2 family heads, is what you have. So you talk about a 2 or 3 generational family living together. Okay. So what does this mean? What does this way of living create in terms of social relationships and some kind of cultural understanding of society? And I bought a nice responsum from a rabbi of Poznan called Isaac the Great. He was rabbi there from 1667 to 1685. In fact, the responsum doesn't deal with Poznan, but with a neighboring city. But the principles involved are quite clear. If this doesn't wake you up, I don't know what will. Concerning Mr. Azrael's wife, about whom Mr. David testified that he saw her acting in an ugly way, in that Mr. Azrael's employee used to hug and kiss her. Mr. David also testified that a few days after he saw this, he saw that the adulterer and the adulteress were standing in the heated room, and that she was holding his genitals in one hand and spoke to him thus. Now, unfortunately, I can't translate the Yiddish of what she said to him, so I don't know. In there, if you can find me a translation, I'd like to look at it. I'm burning it. What's that? Exactly.
What's it?
She says,
this same David testified that at a later time he saw the woman in the heated room lying on her back on the long chest which is there. He saw that her hat had fallen off her head and that the adulterer was standing over her and had picked up her hat. She had pulled down her dress over her legs while she was still lying down. I can go on. I can go on. And this Mr. David also saw that after the Shabbat meal, the adulteress sat with the adulterer in the heated room and let him touch her. She caressed his face, knelt over him, and kissed him while he put his hand under her dress. If we go to the next testimony, a woman called Mrs. Fagel also testified that she used to live in the house of the same Mr. Azrael, and that she once went into the heated room and saw 4 legs lying on the bed, with shoes and socks on. Must have been cold. She jumped back into the next room and said to another woman who was in there, "See what it is to be man and wife. Yesterday they were fighting like wild animals, and just now I saw him pleasuring her." The woman said, "It's a lie. Azrael left early this morning." Oh, it gets worse. This woman refused to believe her and asked the adulterer's fiancée, the adulteress's sister, whether Azrael was there, and she replied that she travelled that day. We saw who the adulterer was. The young man, engaged to the adulteress's sister, went out around the back of the heated room. Okay, we've got another one saying pretty much the same thing. Okay, now before I talk about this a little, this is a rabbinical responsa. Okay, and they are noted for the wealth of the social detail that they present, being legal cases with much detail. However, you really can't approach a responsum in terms of research without looking at what the rabbi actually responded. because this is just the evidence that was presented, and he has to give his ruling. If you go to the very last page of the stuff I've got in there, okay? Now, the issue before him, the legal issue is, okay, if this is true, then the woman is forbidden to her husband. He has to divorce her. And there's a whole question about whether the children are mamzerim, or bastards or not, and that's a major, major issue. And none of the evidence is 100% conclusive. I mean, they saw them hugging and kissing, but the actual act itself wasn't seen. So the question is there enough in this testimony to forbid the woman to her husband? Okay, and it goes on a bit. I'll just read the second paragraph, which is important. And in addition, one of the witnesses to these ugly acts is Mr. David Lesher. He was the first witness. At first, he did not say anything. It was only after the fight he had with Mr. Azriel. Okay, so they'd had a fight. He and the husband were on bad terms. During that argument, he told him his wife was unfaithful in order to disgrace him. Later, when he was asked during the deposition, he repeated the same story about the ugly acts he saw, as is clear from the court records. There is some concern here that he may have spoken out of hatred. It is also questionable in my eyes that he saw these ugly acts, but did not say anything about them to the rabbi in order to prevent forbidden deeds from being committed. Okay? So, two things, or three things here. First of all, the testimony is suspect. Okay? There are personal issues going on here between the witness and the husband. On the other hand, when the rabbi who's responding comes to comment, he doesn't say, this is totally out of the question, this sort of thing never happens, this is not part of our living experience. He doesn't say that at all. For him, it's absolutely clearly part of his living experience. What's his issue? His issue is that if somebody had seen what was going on, they would straight away have gone to who? To the rabbi, and said, Rabbi, look what's happening in the house, we've got to deal with it. Which says two things. It says, first of all, whether or not this actually happened, this is part of Jewish experience. People lived on top of each other. Okay? And you there you go. Very good. It really is late, isn't it? They lived on top of it, yeah. And you didn't have privacy. This is not part of the experience of living in a house in the Jewish quarter of Poznan. I mean, I have other sources also along these lines where intimacy between a man and another man's wife was spotted through the window from the house on the street opposite. He was looking through the window and saw it through the window of the opposite house that they were kissing. This is a whole different way of living, something that we're not used to. And it's very important.
Can I ask one question? In the testimony, there's the amount of the stall or something, okay?
Right.
There's one of the testimonies.
I imagine, these places.
Some stall outside.
Yeah, they go out to do some kind of agricultural activity, and they
it
go
says
together.
with each other like man and wife, as if a husband and wife normally had to go outside if they wanted to do it because there were so many other people inside. Is that possible?
I see what you mean. No, I read that differently. I think he's saying that they went out together.
Yeah.
They went to get water together. They went to deal with whatever animals or whatever the family had, and they did it together. I don't think they're going out to have sex. I had sex inside in the heated room. I mean, it's cold outside, you know. That could have been. What's interesting about this in a number of ways. First of all of life in these houses revolves around the heated room. You go in there, you come out of there. This is where you live. And it's very claustrophobic. Everybody is in and out all the time. So, think about the way this Responsa portrays sex, sexual acts. Okay? There's no embarrassment here. This is quite obvious. There's no problem. This is what happened. This is what we saw. This is what we say. I'm not embarrassed to say it. I don't feel bad about saying it. There's no taboo here. If you live in those conditions, I imagine, seeing sex, seeing the sexual act is not something that is out of the ordinary. There's no feeling of embarrassment here. There's no feeling of prudery or peeping Tom-Marie. Quite the reverse. It's natural. It's what we see all the time. That's what life is in a house like this. Well, no, I don't know. Yeah, go on.
But if there's so many people living on top of each other, coming in and out,
right.
How is such an act of adultery possible then, without going outside?
Well, I imagine it's like most things, you do the best you can in the conditions in which you find yourself. I mean,
But there are similar cases like this all over the responsibility communities where people are not living in private homes. This is part of living in a small community.
adultery happened in all kinds of places, and people saw it. But this, there's something I find intensely claustrophobic about the way this is presented.
Goes into the next room to tell someone else.
That's why I think you'll have it in Prague or in Cracow places.
Oh, Prague and Cracow have much the same conditions. This is one of the more populated cities in Europe. Prague is the most, and Cracow isn't far behind this. What I'm looking to show here, and we'll get on to further, is a question of privacy. There is no privacy.
I think there is a striving for privacy here, in the sense that when the law says that you can't build up a great and large apartment, it's doing a couple of things. It's saying, as you said, that you have to have more units. But in Rome, in the ghetto, there's a fall of marriage rate. The number of people getting married falls after the ghetto is instituted. Because people don't have a place, they don't have a private room. And so, in order to avoid scenes like this, which however people may be embarrassed or not embarrassed to talk about it, it's probably preferable otherwise, in adulthood it's never preferable. At least for people who make laws, they're trying to keep as many separate housing units as possible to avoid contact.
The other thing,
To facilitate more marriages.
Well, one of the most shocking things to me is not the sexual escapade, but the density, and what the density might mean to the Jewish family. One of the great yardsticks of the vernacular is in all contemporary cultures, at least, where the chimney is, or where the hearth is, or fireplace, per family. The idea that there be multiple families around. However, within this date is early, and so the development of the stove hearth is spotty. The homes have some I would hope we have houseplants, and we pray for houseplants of some kind to guide our discussion of what this density could possibly mean. But one could have these stoves, the idea of the warmth from them can be exuded into multiple rooms. I mean, that's the Germans do this for a long period of time. So anyway, it's very important to know about the number of rooms relative to families. But if what you're saying is that there's multiple families around one hearth, that truly is radical. I mean, that's radical by most conceptualizations of how families are traditionally gathered around that all-important heat source of light and cooking and all that.
once more figures so you can see the different sorts of houses there were, the sorts of sizes we're talking about. Okay. Once again, the majority of apartments are not huge. They have 2 or 3 houses, 2 or 3 heated rooms, 2 or 3 apartments. The important figure here is the bottom line, average per heated room, which goes from just 7 to 10, which is once again around 2 families, from 1.7 to 2.1 families per heated room. I just didn't put the bottom line on, which I probably should have done.
But I just want to make sure I didn't quite hear what was said before. One of these families of 10 people could be an extended family.
Yeah. I mean, I just don't know. I imagine that in the majority of cases it was, but I don't think it makes any difference in terms of how you appreciate the space you're in.
It does make one difference, and it's something I'd love to see a lot of people work on, so we can do comparative, some comparative studies between the age of marriage and the spatial organization of the home. Because, you know, my instinct is that in environments like this where sexual contact is, whether or not it's observable, it's possible, right? I mean, that daughters are families cannot think that they are sheltering their daughters from men in an urban environment. It is harder to do it in an urban environment than in a house in the village where she's alone and you're watching her, or the women in the house know who's in the house and who isn't in the house. In environments where people come and go all the time, there's just more opportunity.
True, but on the other hand, you have stronger social control. There's stronger social control. The overcrowding, the claustrophobia, means that it's very difficult to escape notice. Which is why the rabbi appears here. You'd expect the rabbi to know if the news would get out and word would get round. And if that hasn't happened, this is a sign that probably this story is made up. Okay? So that's the other side of it. Living together means that you're never on your own, and so it's very hard to escape somebody's eye.
Unless people don't have any reason to report it, and something, you know, I mean, not all infractions get reported, they get reported for a reason, you know? I mean, is this a society?
Well, this is a serious infraction, and I think sexual infractions are likely, just on the basis of gossip, to be out there as quickly as possible. This has enormous halachic implications. Yeah.
The Shugan, the answer of the rabbi. Are you convinced that the rabbi really is not persuaded by the number of different witnesses that they come, including somebody that wasn't even living there at the first, originally, and then comes back to it? Or is he simply trying to find a technical way to avoid breaking up the marriage of this guy?
His answer opens with the issue of the problems of being strict with these rulings. It has enormous implications for the man, for the wife, for the children, for the adulterer, and this is major.
So is there a position in principle that if at all possible to avoid enforcing the halakhic implications of the decision of adultery, we should go that way and find any way to disqualify it?
This being a legal response, halakhic response, there are two camps. There's people who say you have at all counts to be strict in order to make sure that you don't have any of the mamzerim, and you have a camp of people who say, no, we have to find ways of dealing with this lakula. And I mean, his conclusion is, I'm not going to rule. You have to go back and do the examinations again in a proper halakhic way. He is very contemptuous of the court in this town, of the way they've dealt with it. As he says, you go back and you do the examinations in the proper way, you confront the witnesses with the plaintiff, or the plaintiff with the witnesses. You confront the two cases and you sort it out in that way.
I would just say I think that there is a strong tendency in the halachic courts that if the husband and the wife, this is known as the adulteress here, the accused adulteress and her husband both want to stay married, and there is legal grounds for doing that, the court would be very reluctant to enforce. Right. You see, so in other words, there are, I've seen them very common, there are technical problems with the testimony. Yeah. So here you have a husband and wife say, we don't want to get divorced. Yeah. And here you have, charges going back and forth. And here you have the judge who has the option of saying that we're not going to force it, most of the time, most unusual, they would force divorce in such a situation.
And I'll say, the rabbi from Poznan doesn't make a rule.
Right. It's okay. I'm sure the more issues than working out the details of this law. Yeah.
I have a statistical question.
Yeah.
On this chart,
Oh, yeah.
you have 10, between 7 and 10 people per heated room.
Right.
But heated rooms have 2 bedrooms, let's say, often. So that's not so terribly dense, right? I mean, that statistic is not so terribly dense. It's certainly not by Roman standards. And then the other, before you answer that part of my concern, is how do you know that you have 2 children? That's very low for pre-modern. That's very modern.
When
So
I found these figures,
that's very strange.
I felt exactly the way you felt. And I went round again and looked at the figures again, and I started to collect figures, and surprisingly enough, that average crops up in a number of different
And that means they're practicing contempt. Because, I mean, we're dealing with a real serious problem. Because before, in the 17th century, that's just not physically possible for everyone to only have 2 children.
It's an average. It's an average. You're not talking about everybody. There are some who have lots of kids and some who have 8 kids.
2 per bird is
It's a very low, surprising.
The Jewish family in the ghetto of Italy in the same period is not significantly different.
Well, then that means either that they're practicing infanticide, or because of the lack of privacy, they're not having sex.
Or the kids are dying.
Well, kids are always dying in pre-modern.
Yeah.
50% of all deaths are people under 5 before the 20th century. So kids are always dying in every society. So that's not an answer.
I don't have an answer, but that is actually quite a statement figure that I found from all the places where I can get material, census material that looks halfway reasonable. Family sizes are not what you expect.
Well, they're practicing infanticide.
But this is
You think about Poland.
2 children per woman in the course of
No, I know, it means altogether.
2 children
At the point
moment that a census is taken.
That's true, and so that would be lower, but then it should be 4 or something. I mean, this is the 17th century. This is.
Well, it depends on age of marriage. I mean, the later you get married, the smaller the number of
Exactly.
This is not an age, this is not age of late marriage.
Yeah.
I mean, people tend to assume they get married 13, 14.
No,
Probably exaggerated, but 18, 19, 20 they're getting married. That's not
Getting married
late
in the
marriage.
20s.
Okay.
Fertility doesn't go down to the other.
I know, I've got 2 more things I want to talk about, and I'll try and sum it up. And then, I know it's a very sketchy argument, but the material is not strong. But I think it's important to try and think about these issues and try to understand what that experience was, and in a more real way. Okay. 2 regulations from Cracow, a city not significantly different from Poznan, slightly less people, slightly less crowded, but much the same. Okay. First regulation, that's the page before the last page. First regulation deals with the prohibition on playing cards. Men were forbidden to play cards, they should be studying. Women could play cards, but only at certain particular times. If a woman was in confinement before birth and so on, they were allowed to. On the whole, cards were frowned upon. So the regulation reads, a woman who allows cards to be played in her house is to be punished and fined just like those who actually play. And then it says, and when someone comes to a room of any kind to go in and knocks on the door, if no one wants to open up, then all the women who are there should receive the above punishment. No excuse in the world can help them. That's a very small regulation and not very important, only it says something quite significant. If someone knocks on the door and you don't open it, then you've committed a crime. The expectation here is that privacy is bad. It's hiding sin.
Might be playing cards.
Doesn't. We're only with cards. We've moved on. We've had the sex. We're into the gambling. Okay.
I mean, I read it the way Bernie just read it, that this is sort of qualifying sentence number 1, that we're talking about cards, and if we suspect you of playing cards or with little children, right? We know something's happening, open the door.
No,
I don't know if this is saying in general.
No, you're right. The regulation deals with card playing. And it says, we suspect you of playing cards. But the suspicion is based on the fact that you are private with yourself. You're not opening the door to somebody.
Is that necessarily? Is that maybe?
That's what it is.
Maybe because you know the woman has cards in her house, and therefore.
Well, I think the presumption is that You know, if something else is going up, then you're doing something suspicious.
Yeah, that's the
the
point.
expectation is that there
calm.
is no privacy. You don't have an expectation of privacy.
That's the point.
Closed doors are a bad thing.
The point is there is no expectation of privacy. Privacy is something that's modern. It's something that's modern, not early modern.
Yeah, I think it's more about it being women, you know, just as children, right? You are not autonomous in that way, just close the door. Why does it say women, why not men?
Yeah, that's it, privacy. But you know, it's like in Britain and in Holland, people keep their windows open. You know, it's Calvinist ethic. They don't close the curtains. Because what goes on, the Dutch in particular, you don't close the curtains because what goes on is transparent. There's no sin.
I'm sure that's where this is coming from. Even if this particular regulation deals with women, it's coming from that point. Just to say, if you're in private, then this is not right. Then there's something going on, shouldn't it?
A lot of places in early modern Europe, it was required that craftsmen and artisans keep their shutters open while working in their shop. If you're a shoemaker, you have to keep your shutter open so that even if people who aren't planning to buy shoes can walk down the street and look at your window and see that you're making shoes in an appropriate way, you're not using the wrong kind of materials and you're not cutting corners or whatever. So it's that same principle. Your work life, the workshop should be transparent to passers-by. I mean, so it's similar, it has similar elements to what you're talking about.
So once again, it's another aspect of living. You don't have privacy, but then you don't necessarily expect privacy. Privacy is not something that's on the cultural map of early modern Jews. That has possible implications about development. I mean, this is just, self-right's all been just like that, but this is even worse. It's a question of development of individuality. You don't have personal space. You don't have a place where you're you. You only have space when you're with someone else and you're on view. I'm just throwing it out as an idea.
I don't know. I like the detail a room of any kind. Okay, because when you look at it, whereas you're saying that this regulation shows a society which has no expectation of privacy, we could see this regulation as a regulation coming at a time when people are beginning to demand privacy.
Yes.
And then maybe some types of rooms, people are beginning to act as though those rooms are off limits to the public view.
I think reading it into here might be a stretch, but I think in principle you might be right.
Yeah, because we always know that when you get regulations against a behavior which is in fact beginning.
Right. No, I can see where you're coming from. It might be.
Something is
You need more evidence than I have, unfortunately. Okay, the very last one, then I'll sum it up, and if you have any other comments, I'll be happy to hear. Arrangements for wedding feasts. This is some genuine sumptuary laws from the 16th century. Ted's written about these, but I'm going to quote it anyway. When one pays taxes of up to 10 groszy inclusive, then one may not invite more than 25 people with their wives to a wedding feast. This is apart from the rabbis, a cantor, one beadle, a preacher, a master of ceremonies, and 2 waiters, and all the people who live in the house. These are not included in the 25, but certainly cannot be excluded. People from out of town are not included, but one may only invite 6 unmarried boys and girls as one wishes. All the invitees may send fish. The community beadles must inform the man holding the feast of the rules concerning what he should do on every occasion. It's regimented society. When one pays taxes of 10 to 20 groszy inclusive, one may invite 40 couples, not included in the above categories, who are not included, as well as 6 boys, 4 waiters, girls as he wishes. Unmarried girls, obviously. From 20 groszy to 1 zloty, not inclusive, one may invite 50 couples as above. Apart from the above categories not included, 12 boys, 2 cantors, 2 beadles, 5 waiters. All these kinds of taxpayers may not hold a prenuptial party of any kind, under any pretext, not even just with close relatives and waiters. One may only invite sons and daughters-in-law, and those who live with him in the same heated room. When one may not include any more, even a bride and groom. No beadle can be invited and no public announcement can be made as in other kinds of feast. Well, classic sumptuary legislation, very hard to understand exactly what it all means, and I only want to take out a small point from here, but I think also a significant one. There are groups of people who are not included in the list of invitees. They're people who you just can't do without when you hold a wedding feast. And among them are the people who live in your house. They're put on the same rank as the 25 family members or who you're allowed to invite. If you look in the last one, when they have the prenuptial party, okay, you can only invite your sons and daughters-in-law, and those who live in the same heated room, which is even closer. I think in a quite significant way, this legislation is putting neighbours on a par with family members. The social relations that you develop with the people in your house are so intense that when you come to a family simcha, they're in.
Well, there's another thing here. There's an obvious thing. If you're all sharing one heated room,
right,
and you run the party in the room, you can't.
You're talking about Polish Jews. What are you talking about? Of course you can.
No, you can't because there's nowhere for them to go. You're using the common shared space to which they have a right.
I think there's an interesting issue here. Katz, writing about the Jewish family, talked about family networks as being one of the basic institutions of Jewish society, and he's undoubtedly right. But thinking about it in the context of this, the family, which was normally quite widespread, far-flung, is much more an economic network than it is a social network. These are people you do, when you travel for business, you're in contact with them, they'll help you with your business. The social network, the close social network, here suggests, I'm saying this is all highly suggestive, and it suggests that the actual social network on which you rely and which is your social milieu are not your family, but in fact the people with whom you share house in these highly cramped conditions. Conclusions in point number one, obviously the house is a basic component of Jewish urban space. Two, Jewish houses were different from Polish houses. They're much more crowded. So the Jewish house itself is different. It's physically different. Conditions are different from what is outside the Jewish quarter. Among other things, Jews viewed their houses not just in legal and physical categories, but in halachic categories, which gave the house an actual Jewish nature. The house itself has a Jewish component to it. The hub of the house is the heated room. And those who shared the houses and the heated rooms create a social network which is perhaps closer than the family networks in terms of social contact. Number six, the social networks that are created are the basis for the social control of the community. Okay? The fact that you are so enmeshed in this hub of houses and of flats and of living together, this is what gives the community its cohesion, what allows the community to impose itself on the individual. Cultural implications, social needs, what does it say? Oh, okay, social needs can mitigate the views of society as being divinely ordained. Perceptions of intimacy, of physical intimacy, seem to have been more widespread. People saw it all the time, children with their parents, neighbours with whatever. And there are limits on personal space, which I suggested may have to do with the development of individuality, and Stephanie said, I think smartly, that the fact that this is now becoming an issue may suggest that there's a new demand being made. And I'll end with another point I found. No, I won't, I'll end there.
Thank you.